I have known Dr. Ronald Cicurel for quite some time now, and I have learned a lot from him regarding mathematics and his other works, and also grateful to have him here with us on stage right now. Yeah, let's welcome Dr. Ronald.
First of all, I'm not a professional neuroscientist. I'm an amateur. I'm a purely amateur. In fact, I started studying neuroscience in 2002, 2003, so it's not my subject. I know more about mathematics and a little bit of physics, but I don't know so much about neurosciences. I came to neuroscience because I was working in EPFL, and I met a man named Henry Markram, who was coming from Israel, and who had a crazy idea. He wanted to do a computer model of the brain. That was in 2004. And we had long discussions together, and we were joined by a small group of professors in EPFL, and we proposed this project to the direction of the establishment, and it was accepted. And we started this Blue Brain project. We had the support of IBM, who gave us a very a high-power computer that was installed in Lausanne, and we started working. But my work was essentially discussing with Henry, and it was more mathematics than neuroscience. But it corresponded to something that was a deep dream of mine, to know what is the nature of reality. The question of the nature of reality bothered me since I was a young guy. In fact, a few years after my PhD, I studied Kurt Gödel, and that really changed my life and occupied my thoughts for the last 50 years, I could say. Not only the mathematical side of Kurt Gödel, but what it meant philosophically. And Henry and me, we didn't have exactly the same opinion. I thought it was not possible to simulate the brain to the extent that Henry wanted to do it. Henry really thought that one could build a simulation that when it would be perfected, would become even conscious and would behave like a really human brain. I did not agree with this, but never mind, discussing is always a positive thing, and so I had the opportunity with Blue Brain to meet all sorts of neuroscientists all over the world, because a lot of people came to see us, and we traveled quite a lot to meet people. And one of the persons I met while working on the Blue Brain was Miguel Nicolelis. And Miguel Nicolelis had rather ideas similar to mine. And after 1 or 2 years, we really became friends and started working together. And it hasn't stopped until now. We still continue working together. I left Blue Brain when it became the human brain, that around 2010. After that, I wrote the first book on the subject in French. If I translated this in English, it was named The Computer Will Not Digest the Brain. The goal of this first book was to say that there are good arguments showing that a brain simulation will never be a real brain. And something who is mechanic cannot simulate something who is organic. Normally, when you speak with computer scientists, and I know many of them, you tell them a Turing machine or a computer cannot simulate an organism or cannot simulate a brain. They ask you, what can a brain do that a computer cannot do? Give me one simple example of something that a brain can do and a computer cannot do. And that's a tricky question, because as soon as you answer that question, you fall in a sort of trap because of reasons that I will explain later on. But it's a tricky question. For instance, many of you know perhaps Schmidt-Huber, who's a famous computer scientist in Switzerland. And I remember at one of his conferences, there was a lady there who asked, well, Mr. Schmidhuber, you cannot simulate a feeling. And Schmidhuber said, what feeling? And she said, oh, let's say love. You can't simulate love. And Schmidhuber answered, give me a definition of love and I will program a simulation for you. And he is correct. If you can give a definition, you can program it. The problem is only that you cannot give a definition of a feeling, because whatever definition you give, the feeling can be experienced otherwise by somebody else. A definition is too limited, too precise, and if you start putting a feeling into a limited number of precise words, like in a definition, then you've lost the feeling itself. The feeling is a first-party vision, and the definition is a third-party vision. I don't know if you remember what Bertrand Russell said. There are two types of definitions. There's a definition by acquisition, like the children do up to 7 years old. It's a definition where you live something. For instance, you can only learn how to ride a bicycle or play tennis by riding the bicycle or by playing tennis. You cannot read a book, and the result of reading the book would be to be able to ride a bike. You have to do it. So there's this kind of definition by acquisition, and you have the definition by description, who is the definition you find in the dictionary, who is a word equal a series of other words. Whatever you say by defining a word equal another word, then you can program it. But if it's something who is only definable by acquisition, well, it's not programmable. So it's a little bit tricky to understand that an organism is something different than a mechanism. It's a deep subject, and there's a deep difference, and I'll come back to this difference a little bit later. So I met Miguel while working with the Blue Brain project, and we started discussing on those subjects, especially on the nature of intelligence and also on the nature of life. And we regrouped in a little monograph named The Relativistic Brain, the key arguments who show the difference between an organism and a mechanism. Miguel had published a paper in 2006, I think, on how ensembles of neurons form to examine a concept. And he showed that it was for the purpose of BMI. In brain-machine interface, you read the brain signals and you decode them in a way that a computer or a machine can understand the signal that you have decoded. For this to be able to happen, you must always have the same ensemble of neurons who treat the concept that you are trying to decode. If it's never the same ensemble who treats it, then you cannot decode it. There's no code. For motor activity, there's enough stability in the signal to be able to decode it. But for more abstract things, like abstract thinking or like feelings, there's not a unique ensemble of neurons who will give you the signal. So decoding is not possible. There are many articles I see who are published saying we can read the brain directly by decoding the signals. And in fact, you never read the brain. What you read is always motor signals and not higher functions. So after the relativistic brain, I continue working on that subject. And it took me about 5 years to write this Brain-Centric. In fact, the first version was pretty extensive. It had about 800 pages. Then I decided it was not what I wanted to do. It was not good enough. And I couldn't group all I wanted to say in one book. I had to divide it in several books. So the book that came out now is only on the mental space. And the mental space, I'll try to give you an idea of what I mean by mental space. I could have called it the psyche, but I didn't want to use the psychological language because it has already implications. Psychology was mainly done to cure diseases or to cure trauma, and it was not the goal here. The goal here was to study reality, the nature of reality. So I called it the mental space. Cybernetics tells us that for a regulator to be a good regulator, it must have representations of what it is regulating. So we know that the brain functions with representations. And those representations especially come from our perceptions, what we see, what we touch, what we feel. Those perceptions create in the mental space representations. Representations, if you go at the physical level, at the level of the brain, there are groups of neurons or networks of groups of neurons, but I will call them simply representations. Perception has been a problem for a long time. I remember reading André Weil, who was thinking about perception and who could not understand how it works. How is it that we see something who is out there? And those problems of perception concentrated in one big neuroscience problem that everybody knows. It's the binding problem. How is it that something who comes for our eyes, for our ears, for our touch, the brain manages to do it one unique entity and a stable entity? The signal doesn't follow the same pathways if it comes from the ears or from the eyes or from the touch or from other, and it doesn't go at the same speed. So we have all these signals in disorder that come to the brain, and the brain manages to make out of it one coherent entity. And that was a big problem. It was a big problem until a certain number of people, including Miguel in his first book, Beyond Boundaries, and it's a little bit a result of the Libet experiment also. So the perception is not initiated outside, it's initiated within the brain itself. It's an anticipatory system. The brain basically works by expectation. We always expect something, and because we expect it, we see it or we feel it. When you walk, for instance, you expect that the ground will be solid under your foot. When I speak, you're expecting my next word. When we read a book, we don't read every word to the end. One or two letters are enough to expect the word that is going to come, or expect the whole sentence, or expect. We always work by expectation. And when the sensory information does not correspond to expectation, we change the expectation, we adapt to the sensory information. So expectation is a very important thing for the human brain. When you think about that, it suggests to you, okay, if the perception is initiated by the brain, could I initiate other perceptions? What creates the reality? Is it created by outside or by inside the brain? So when you study perception, naturally you fall on questions of the nature of reality. So we have this mental space, and the mental space would be the whole our representation. Whatever we represent is inside this mental space. And we can divide it in two parts. This is important. There's what I call the natural space is before we have words, we still can feel, we can think, we have a brain activity, we can adapt. And as long as it doesn't have words, I call it the natural world. And slowly we build the verbal world where we put words on things. When I was young, I remember having read the book of Alfred Korzybski, whose title is Science and Sanity, an introduction to non-Aristotelian systems and general semantic. And Korzybski, it was in the 1930s, suggested that the words are not the thing that they represent. It seems obvious, but it's not that obvious. It is generally known with the slogan who remained out of his work, who says the map is not the territory. And it seems obvious, but it's not as obvious as that. If you think about it, we are so used now to work with maps that we don't distinguish map and territory. We don't distinguish what the verbal world creates and the reality outside. And whatever we create verbally is a mental creation. What is outside, we don't know. So we have those two worlds in our mental space. The natural where learning is by acquisition, where there are feelings, and we have the verbal world. And in there, this ensemble is an ensemble of representation. Now, it's important to notice that any mental representation, as it is initiated in the brain, is related to a feeling. A feeling is the translation of an emotion. An emotion is a physical thing. When you have an emotion, you have a physical reaction inside your brain and inside your body. You don't only think about it, you feel it physically. You have a physical movement. And if you think about that quite clearly, and you remember Descartes' problem. Descartes distinguished the physical, the body, and the spirit. And we call that dualism. There are two types of entity, the spiritual entity and the material physical entity. And he could explain how a physical entity interacts with another physical entity, but he couldn't explain how a spiritual entity could act on material entity. And he couldn't explain it because in science, for two objects to interact one with another, they must exchange energy. And as a spiritual entity has no energy, it's purely immaterial. How can it interact on the physical? That was Descartes' problem. And not being able to explain that, most of the world became monist, materialist, and believes that there's one kind of matter and everything is material. There's only matter who is equivalent to energy and nothing else. Normally, our science today works under one paradigm that I call ERP, external reality paradigm. We all believe that what we are speaking about is external reality. The basic of Brain-Centric is to say that we cannot know what is out there. We can only know our representation of out there. When I touch this computer in front of me, or I see this computer in front of me, what I know is not what is out there, but my representation of what is out there. I can only know something that happens in my brain. I can not know what is outside. So you could think, well, we still are able to do things with what is outside. So some knowledge we have. Yes, we do have some knowledge, and because of very obvious Darwinian reasons, our presentations are good enough. So the basic concept of Brain-Centric is to say, contrary to external reality paradigm, to say what we can know is our representation of what is out there and not out there itself. In the Kortsipsky language that I mentioned before, we can only know our map of reality, we cannot know reality itself. So it's important to understand how our mental space works, because this mental space is creating the reality we know. So I said the mental space is composed of two regions, the natural space and the verbal space. The natural space works basically on analogy. For instance, when you want to remember something, you use rather analogy. You say, oh, I was there in Paris, I was with that person, and you relate things by analogy. The verbal space works rather digitally. That's what we expressed in the relativistic brain by suggesting that the brain works with two systems, an analog and a digital system that are continuously interacting one with the other. And it also has two sources of information. One source who's the sensory information that comes from out there, and the other source comes from the body, and normally we call it the feelings. So when we build a representation, it's always related to feelings, and it's not only information that comes from out there. So there's always an analog part and a digital part. There's a combination of both. I will now just come back to this idea of the difference between a mechanism and an organism. When we create something, we can create it simply by analogy. Like if a painter does a painting, or if we copy nature to build an object, or we can use something more digital. When we have an idea, we transform this idea in a plan, we decompose it into parts, and we have a blueprint, and then we produce it. Then it can be reproduced, copied, industrialized. Those are two types of very different creation. One is rather creation of the natural space, and the other is rather creation of a verbal world. Any mechanism has gone through this digitalization part, through this blueprint, has used the language, so has used the verbal world in one way or another. So whatever we create this way is a mechanism, and it can be decomposed. It can be reversed engineered. When we have a motor, we can put it in pieces and rebuild it, or redo a blueprint to reverse engineer it. An organism you cannot reverse engineer it because it was never engineered in the first place. It has never been built. The illusion comes basically because of language. It has a grammar, it has a structure, and it projects its structure on the nature of the reality we perceive. A tree, for instance, is not a trunk, branches, leaves. It's not the sum of those things. All those things are together. Because of our approach, the approach of the mental space, with decomposing by reduction and recomposing, we individuate objects in reality, we fragment reality out there, we fragment what is out there into pieces. But it's our fragmentation based on the individuation that our mental space is able to do. Probably that the mental space of an extraterrestrial, an alien, would be different and would build a different reality that we would build, because his way, he would perhaps not fragment, or fragment in a different way. Even on our planet, between the Oriental and the Occidental way of thinking, there's a different approach in the way we fragment. In the Eastern Hemisphere, you tend to see things more globally. In Europe and in America, we tend to see them more as separate entities. So you probably know David Bohm. He was very worried about this question of fragmentation. He was very worried that we fragment things in a certain way. And perhaps it's not the right way to fragment, or perhaps simply by fragmenting, we lose a big part of reality. So we have this mental space, we have perception. Perception are built by anticipation, by expectation, and normally you have a system of trial and error who makes your representation better and better over time. We would not have survived if our representations of what is out there were not good enough. But it doesn't mean that because they are good enough that it is out there, that it is the nature of reality. We cannot know the nature of reality. For instance, if a planet orbits the sun, we can describe the planet, we can describe the orbit very precisely. We have fragmented the planet, its mass, its substance, its components, and its movement. We have separated two things. We describe the planet and we describe its movement separately. And how do we do that? We add laws, and the planet is the initial conditions, and the laws are how the planet moves, how the planet evolves over time. But the planet itself, it moves, but it doesn't know the Newton laws. So Newton laws are mental creation, and this way of explaining things or describing things is purely what our mental space has created. It's not reality out there. So globally, science is a creation of the verbal world of our mental space. Everything goes through words. properly defined words, and combination, the arrangement of words is done by measurement. Brain-Centric examines how this mental space works. This first part examines how the mental space works, and especially what are its limitations. That's where Gödel's and Turing's approach becomes important. The problem with the verbal world is that it is self-contained. You define a word with other words. That means that the first words are never defined, because to define, and those are primitive words, and our language is full of primitive words like space, time, gravity, name them. They are never really defined. Einstein defines time as what the clocks indicate, what the clocks measure. But what is a clock is something to measure time. So time itself is never defined. Length is never defined. The meter, before it was defined by a piece of metal who was deposited in Paris, now it's a percentage of wavelength or whatever. But those definitions are always circular. You always have circularity. So circularity is created by the fact that the verbal world, as I said before, uses causality. Normally, ERP, external reality paradigm, says that causality is a property of out there, of the universe. But for brain-centrism, as for many, many philosophers and scientists, causality is a pure brain creation. There's no causality out there. Causality is the way the verbal space relates one thing to another. It's a way to minimize the energy consumption of the brain, and it's a way to lower the entropy of the brain for the verbal space. For the natural space, it's analogy. There's no analogy out there. For two things to be analog, there must be some observer who observes the analogy. The analogy is a property of the mental space of the observer, as is the causality. There's no causality. But as the verbal space uses causality, causality leads to infinite regress as soon as you have self-referral proposals. That's what Gödel used to prove his theorem. He used a self-referral proposal, and he translated it into mathematics and showed that there were true proposals who could not be proven true within the system. And the verbal space and mental space, because of its own structure, creates blind spots. Those blind spots, you see them as soon as you ask iterative questions on why this, because of, that's causality, and why this, because of, and you go backwards, and there's no end. So there's no end because of the way the mental space works. It's not because there's no end out there. There's no end because we want to observe out there through the way our verbal space works. This creates what I call blind spots. Spots where, because of the structure of the mental space itself, we can give no answer. Or any answer will always be a sort of guessing. It cannot be a real answer. The typical questions are, for instance, when consciousness examines itself and you ask what is consciousness, it's typically you are here in a self-referral situation and you create a blind spot. But Gödel's theorem is typically the sign that you have a blind spot. And in fact, if you examine things closely, you see, for instance, all the no-go theorems in quantum physics are equivalent to blind spots. There can be no randomness out there. Randomness is always a creation of the mental space itself. So those are part of the subjects that are examined by the study of the mental space in this first part of Brain-Centric. perhaps I should stop there because I already said many things, and I'm not sure I'm not sure if it's understandable and interesting for you. So I'll stop there for a moment.
Professor, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and you've given us some incredible pearls of wisdom, of intellectual thought, of physical dimension, and so much more. Thank you so much for being here. We can ask some questions. We have Dr. Roshanak, and we have a lot of other fantastic folks in the panel as well. So it's up to you how you're feeling, if you would like to continue, or would you like to take a few short questions right now?
No, I would be happy to take some questions because it would put me on track with what you're feeling. If no, I feel that I'm saying things, but I don't know up to what point it's interesting for you or not.
Absolutely. I'll just do a quick reset. You've joined us here at Quantum Photonics on Clubhouse, one of the largest clubs discussing advanced science, spirituality, psychology, and many other topics. Today we have Professor Ronald. He is the alumni of École Polytechnique in Switzerland, part of the Blue Brain Project, a polyglot, has digested and divested in many of the big questions, the origins, the brain, mind, information, digital and analog. You've been hearing about some of his works in so many different areas and bringing us together. So thank you for being here, everybody. And Dr. Roshanak, the floor is yours for your question. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ronald, for this beautiful and eloquent layout. And while it's true that the traditional approach to semantic problems of language are still being debated, but we do have these, deep-seated semantic structures in the brain, I'm more questioning the idea of feature abstraction, as you refer to it, especially with the East versus the Western approach, and how you would connect that with respect to the binding problem and mental spaces. So, the way that classically, according to Huguette vision occurs is through this sort of hierarchical extraction of the features of the visual scene and then this reintegration. And then, according to the work that was done by Charlie Gray and Wolf Singer some decades ago, with finding the 40 hertz oscillations being present to perhaps be a resolution to the idea of the binding problem. It's not that we are intentionally abstracting features of the space, but rather this is a result of the way that the system is actually set up. And yes, the brain is an open system. So where does this idea of mental space and perhaps, these control parameters and order parameters with respect to nonlinear dynamical systems theory, in combination with the more neurophysiological structures that we have in place, come together with the idea of mental space? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. I'm not sure that I'm able to answer, but for me or for us, when you consider the approach by expectation, the binding problem completely disappears because the expectation is already unified to start with, and then it's adapted through perceptual information. So there's no more binding problem. The binding problem comes when you consider the perception is initiated outside. But if you consider that the perception is initiated within the brain, there's no binding problem. I don't know if this can help your thinking, but that's the way we see it.
But nonetheless, the information comes in through the visual stream, fragmented.
It comes in fragmented, yeah. It comes in fragmented. We cannot avoid that.
So how is the reconciliation of this fragmented input and this internal representation through expectation?
No, I didn't express myself well enough. There's a complete expectation before to start with, and this expectation is modified and adapted. There's a lot of information that we simply neglect, as there's the information that we fill in. But initially, there is a representation. This representation gets completed, modified, adapted for sensory perception. But there's no binding problem. It's only an adaptation of something that is currently existing. If some sensory information comes in that is not part of the expectation, then we are surprised, and the brain proposes another expectation to replace it. I don't know if I'm making myself understood or not, but that's how we see things. And if you read Miguel's book, Beyond Boundary, it's explained quite in details.
So let me just say briefly that the name of this room is also the name of Dr. Ronald's book, which is Volume 1, and that describes sort of how these questions are hard to get to briefly. And also we have about 18 people on stage, and we want to get to everyone. So let's go to probably Serena. I know you had a question or a couple questions, so go ahead.
Thank you so much, Isaac. This is Sharina, and I am going to answer the question about the binding problem because I'm a sensory systems neuroscientist. And as an experimentalist in this field, okay, there are things that are unexpected that happen in our environment all the time that we have to take care of. Say that we're running through the forest and there are twigs in the way, and we have to be able to deal with this stuff and catch ourselves and deal with stuff that comes out of nowhere. So what do we do? And the answer is that our brains kind of take care of it by having fast rhythms in the brain, such as the 40 hertz oscillations that you've mentioned, gamma rhythms. Okay, since the brain is firing fast and it's kind of revved up to take care of information that is changing quickly, then this makes it easier for different sensory systems to bind information together with decent enough signals to hopefully take care of this from an evolutionary perspective.
That was really quite amazing. Some of those things sort of ring true, especially if alternate perspectives of looking at consciousness have been explored. So you mentioned David Bohm, and David Bohm was heavily influenced by this thinker J. Krishnamurti, who would speak about, he would often say this, right, that the word is not the thing itself. So I just wanted to put that there. But so if we speak about, let's say, sensations, emotions, thought, I was wondering if you can speak to that a little bit about sort of the neuroscientific part of it and also the verbal expression of it. What I mean is that we often say, oh, I feel good or I feel bad, and then there is an actual sort of movement that's happened in the brain, and then we give a verbal expression to it. So I don't know if you can say something about that. That's my first question. Where does the expectation come from? Like, what is the root of expectation? Is it always based on past experience and our past experience of an object? Or is there a possibility that there is even expectation without that? So I don't know if those are clear, but I would love to hear what you have to say on that.
Okay. In fact, I would say read my book because I have gone in quite a lot of details on that question. But perhaps I could say this. We have two sources of information. One comes from inside, and it's bodily expectation. That means it's or experience or genetics or a combination of all those things. And we have also information who comes through our senses. And all those combine and create our expectation. There's not only one source, but there are many sources. And but we could say that emotions are always the deepest source of expectation, because our memory is basically based on emotions. We remember a feeling more than we remember a fact. By remembering the feeling, the fact comes to our mind. But what creates the liaison in the natural space is always a feeling. So the source is always a feeling. That also gives some thoughts to how we can solve the dualism problem. Because if any representation is related to feelings, to create the complete representation of an object. In fact, there's a complete network of representations that are activated at the same time. And each one of these representations is associated to its own feeling. So it's impossible to only convince somebody by words. He has to put the right feelings behind those words to have a conviction. So that also, as I said, explains a little bit how the thoughts, the spiritual can act on the body, because every time you have a representation of whatever thing, then you have feelings associated, and feelings derive from emotions who are physical. So any thought will have a physical reaction, as any word can have a physical reaction on our body, and that's the way spiritual things do act on material things. Now I have obviously forgotten your first question, so could you repeat it for me?
Well, you touched on it, I guess, but it was about emotion and I guess thought, which what I would bring into it is thought, how you differentiate between the two and their verbal expression of it. When I say I feel good, I feel bad,
Oh, yeah.
etc. Right?
Yes. Well, I don't know if you read the relativistic brain, but ERP, external reality paradigm, tends to recognize only Shannon information, digital information. And I even saw an article the other day that's saying that information was a further state of matter. Some physicists believe that. I think it's completely absurd. There cannot be information without a mental space. There's no information out there. Information is what a mental space does about things who are out there. So basically, we tend to consider only digital information. But there's another type of information, and it's basically the information that the natural world uses, and we called it Gödelian information. When you feel pain, it's not about pain, it's pain itself. The verbal world is always about something. It's an abstraction. It's not the subject, it's about the subject. But the feeling is not about the feeling, it's the feeling itself. That's why it's not simulable, because when you simulate something about. But when you feel, it's not about. When it hurts, it hurts. It's not about hurting. When you speak about it, then you speak about what you feel. But it's only about, it's not what you feel effectively. The digital information does nothing. It can be there, but it doesn't act. That's why I said the planet turns around the sun without knowing the Newton laws. Newton laws don't make it turn. To make it turn, we have to consider another type of information who's not measurable, and we called it Gödelian information. I don't know if this answers your question.
Absolutely.
But I agree with any one of you that this is very controversial, because it means that there are things that science in a traditional way cannot describe. And basically that's what we are saying, is that there are things that science cannot describe with its actual method of description. That means that we are proposing to extend the landscape of causes. We are not only looking for causes out there, but we are also looking for causes within the mental space itself. And there are things that are explained in a much easier way if we consider the way the mental space works, especially in quantum physics. The notion of existence in physics has changed very much over time. At the beginning, something existed if it was basically observable. Then we noticed that if the object was too small, simply we could not, the wavelength, it fell within the amplitude of the wave, and we could not observe it because it's too small. So we changed the definition of existence by saying that something exists if it's useful to explain something who's observable. It doesn't need to be observable by itself. It only needs to explain. So what happened when we use the second type of definition? We introduce the mental space in the observation. There's no more objectivity because we have introduced the mental space itself in the existence. For instance, particles that cannot be observed, an electron or a photon, nobody has ever seen a photon or an electron. It cannot be observed. What we observe, it's consequences of the photon or of the electron. So it exists because it's useful to explain something that we observe.
That was really great, Dr. Ronald. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks everyone. I really appreciate all your support, and thanks Dr. Ronald. So we hope you enjoy our discussion, and we have millions of questions to ask you. I'm sure everyone on the stage want to ask questions. I will just give the mic to Katerina. So Katerina, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for giving us this insight about your work, and I'm a big fan. So I have two different types of questions. One, just for the sake of discussion, to give some controversy, although I agree on what you say. But what do you say about people that don't have pain receptors or don't have a lack of receptors that transmit anxiety? We know a few people that can't perceive any pain. However, they lack these emotions, but they are still able to modify the world around us and have a model in their head. So that's that's what's in my thoughts spontaneously. Then I have this other example where this AI was introduced to curiosity, and this AI started outperforming humans in games because the reward was programmed towards curiosity, not just performance itself. I think I read an article a while ago that actually an AI came kind of addicted to randomness, to curiosity based on that. And the second part is a completely different topic. So how do you see the increased connectivity we have nowadays, so exposing our cultures with each other, which is great on one side, but on the other side, what I always think, it will make us more towards a monoculture because we interfere way too much with each other's ways of thinking and their interpretation of our world. And we see that languages are dying, and this is just a symptom of the diversity of our reality representations, or the diversity of worlds, and our own minds are shrinking, which I think is really bad for the future to create innovation, more creativity. So I would really curious about your thoughts about this topic.
I can only agree with you. I think diversity is absolutely important. In fact, the whole book, Brain-Centric, is based on the idea of survival. Survival is the basic energy, the basic that leads to everything. It's because of survival that we have developed curiosity. And because of curiosity that we have developed knowledge in general. So the basic is really survival, and survival requires diversity. The problem is that by concentrating everything into language, we reduce diversity in a dramatic way. For millions of years, we adapted to an external environment. So what we are is a sort of reflection, a sort of mirror reflection of what is outside, because we adapted to what is outside, and we had to be able to survive in this environment. So we were perfectly integrated to an environment, and now the verbal world has created this phenomenon, is that we are adapting to our own creations. We are not adapting to something who comes from outside. So adapting to our own creation is a very dangerous thing, because it creates circularity, and we have no more external guidance to where we are going. We are not guided by nature, but we are guided by what we have ourselves created. And that's one of the big dangers of the verbal world. Adaptation is completely essential, and what makes one of the big difference between us and artificial intelligence is that artificial intelligence has only a verbal world. It has not the natural world. That's why we can know that something is true, because we can get out of the verbal world and refer to our natural world. We feel it's true, and that is knowledge. A computer or a machine will only navigate within its verbal world. It doesn't have any natural world. It has been built. It has not evolved. So it cannot have a natural world. So it doesn't have as much levels of adaptation as we have. Even if there's no solution, we can always find a solution out of the circularity, the closeness of the verbal world.
Professor Ronald, that was perfect. That was music to my ears, how you describe differentiation of artificial intelligence versus the human adaptation process. And we want to appreciate your time and appreciate your wisdom and sharing your knowledge. And you used that right before I interrupted you. So your knowledge is what we are truly appreciative. We have these sessions on Clubhouse every night, and we discuss many topics. And today you've really shown a wonderful description of the perception of reality. So thank you very much for that. We'll just do a little interlude for just a minute or two. We'll just be having a little bit of light music in the background.
Yeah, thanks, Iman.
You are here with us in Quantum Photonics and Clubhouse. We are discussing with Professor Ronald how mental space builds realities. Dr. Ronald has joined us and illustrated how brain-centric and our perception of the natural world and the verbal world and has really captured our imagination, but our reality as well. Isaac, Sierra, Cecile, Katerina, Wissam, some of the regulars in the Quantum Photonics, Dr. Ali Reza, our psychiatrist, and so many more. Wissam, neuroscientist, Katerina, Kay, everyone, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Ronald, we're here almost every night for an hour, sometimes more, and thank you very much from all of us for being here. I officially want to just say thank you for your time. And where would you like to take the conversation, Professor?
Yes, I would just like to say something because I think I was not precise enough. The higher mental qualities belong all to the natural world. For instance, understanding, there's no understanding with only a verbal world. A computer cannot understand anything. It cannot understand the number one. To have understanding, you must have feelings. Without a feeling, you have no understanding. We all know that. When we understand, it's a feeling. We have the feeling that we understand. We can understand the same thing 3 years later and understand it differently because we have another feeling. And the feeling is created by our whole environment, our whole... Understanding is basically a feeling, and we work by understanding. And a computer cannot have it. Intuition is typically a quality of the natural world. There's no intuition in the verbal world. In the verbal world, you have rules. You have grammar rules. And you don't have intuition. Free will, for instance, is also a feeling. We, from the first-person perspective, we feel that we are free. And even if in a third-person perspective, physicists can tell you, no, we are in a Laplacian universe, and there's no possibility of freedom of will. It's an illusion. It's an illusion perhaps for the verbal world, but for the natural world, who is the world in which we live, we have free will. Time and space are also feelings. It's also something who is issued of the natural world. There's no time and there's no space out there. It's our creation to produce understanding of the mental space. So the mental space creates the way we build our reality, and it creates it basically because of the natural world. Then we explain it through the verbal world, but we live it through the natural world. So I think I didn't make that clear enough before. That's why I wanted to speak about it a little bit more in detail. And perhaps I would have also a question for those of you who are quantum physicists, because if the mental space works by expectations and the objects in quantum physics are mathematical objects basically, and not subject to direct observation, one can wonder what part of quantum physics is the result of the mental space itself and not of what is happening out there. And I studied quite in detail those no-go theorems, and you see, for instance, Bell's proof. Basically, it uses indeterminacy in the phase space. So it uses something equivalent to Turing or Gödel's theorem in the phase space. Basically, it's a mental space problem. The explanation is not a property of out there. It's a property of the mental space who cannot know. It's a limitation of the mental space. It's not a limitation of the universe. So I wonder how physicists would react to that.
Your question is profound, and I think that people, not just physicists, but philosophers and many others have struggled with this paradigm. And just a quick thought that I can share is that in the physics and in the physical observation, assumptions and constants are something that are foundational. And those are measured with consistent experimentation. But assumption and constant are the bedrock for some of the, not just issues, but some of the current advancements in the quantum physics world. And please, someone, feel free to jump in anytime and take over to what I'm saying. Kay?
I just wanted to add to that, and I think, Dr. Ronald, you asked a very profound question. I think if we consider it in terms of having some sort of mental space, it's almost like projecting a vector onto a set of axes. Like, you can only handle the dimensionality that you have. So to the degree that our mental space is not able to represent accurately all of the dimensions of the universe, that is our limit.
I think it's a very interesting subject, and I think that by extending our explanatory landscape to the mental space itself, we could broaden the perspective of what can be done in physics. I'm pretty sure of that.
I want to introduce the things that I found quickly just after you asked that question. So there's a few different theories talking about quantum mind and quantum consciousness. And in this theory, it mentions there's a group of hypotheses using like the superpositions and different wave function collapses to describe the interaction with conscious minds. And I also quickly went over your book. I think in a few chapters you mentioned like the Russian doors and how the physical world with mental world world interact. And so there's another theory that is raised by David Chalmers. He mentioned a theory called dualistic consciousness. I think that's something maybe relevant for our future discussions to explain how the mental world use the different superposition of wave functions to describe the neurons or other physical parts to interact. So thank you, Dr. Ronald.
Thank you. I'll just say briefly from a philosophical perspective that this is getting into, I'm sure Dr. Ronald is very familiar, these Kantian, manual Kantian perspectives, which is that because we're so limited by our senses, we don't know how much we don't know. Like, what we know could be less than 1%, could be like 1% of the things that there are. But then there's the issue of, like, there's the unknown unknowns, and there's the unknowable unknowns. But the biggest limitation to all of these, especially when you get into quantum physics theories and theories of reality and all of these, is the limitations of our mind, because everything seems to be filtered through our senses. Although that's not completely true. Like in the East, they talk about almost like a sixth sense is that of like the imagination, which is true. There's so much knowledge that doesn't come from the five senses, but it comes from like our internal state, our internal knowledge bringing forth more knowledge. But still, even with that, our knowledge is super limited. But I think what Dr. Ronald brings up is this important thing that if we study, rather than the material world so much, study more the mental space, then we find more of what our scope and limitations and capabilities are in coming to knowledge. And within that sort of internal reflection of what our capabilities are as conscious entities or intelligent observers, you might say, then we will widen that, perhaps more than we do so by studying atoms and photons, although both need to be done. But yeah, go ahead, Dr. Ronald, and then we'll get to some more questions.
No, I agree perfectly with what you're saying. In fact, in the book, I have a certain number of paragraphs who speak about extraterrestrial intelligence, because I believe the only hope for us to have a real third-party vision is to meet an extraterrestrial who would have a completely different mental space than we have. If he has a totally, completely mental space, he perhaps will not even see us, or we will not even see him. We will not even know he's there. But hopefully, it's different, but not completely different, and we can still communicate. But he would perhaps see things in a way so different than we see them that we would really broaden our perspective. But alone, as human beings alone, we have a sort of closed system in our knowledge. We cannot go beyond certain boundaries. When we go beyond the boundaries of science, it's always by non-scientific things, by intuition, by feelings. I said at the beginning of my little talk that we had two sources of information. Some people would believe we have three sources of information. We have a sort of a divine source, or as Einstein thought, we are inspired by the whole universe in one way. Possibly we have this source of communication, but it's also Gödelian information, so we cannot distinguish it. If we constrain ourselves, if we limit ourselves only to Shannon information, then we miss a big part of the world. We must put gloves when we touch at it, but we must accept to consider that there is Gödelian information, and that this Gödelian information, we cannot put it into a mathematical language. It's simply, it escapes from that. It's beyond that.
Yeah, and let me just say, too, to clarify, the Gödelian information is this category of the unknowable, but it's really, really, really important to acknowledge the unknowable, because oftentimes if people aren't careful, we want to act, it's kind of like a egotistical left hemisphere way of looking at the world, is that we want to act like we know everything, or know everything that we can, or just like a few more experiments and then we'll know everything we need to know. It's not just that that's not true, but it gives a false reality, not just like an untrue reality, but a false reality. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I think it's important to realize that whatever we know it because of the unknowable. It's the problem of materialism. When you ask real hard materialist physicists, where do those physical equations come from? Where are they? Some of them are still Platonist, I think you say in English. But if they are Platonist, it means that you must believe in some other, you are in a certain way dualist. So being purely materialist doesn't mean anything. To be materialist, you have to start by being idealist. So before any knowledge, there's always something who is beyond knowledge. The natural world comes before the verbal world. The verbal world is recent. We have structured language for the last 20, 30, 50,000 years. Before that, we lived without verbal language. We didn't have the same categories as we have now. We didn't structure the world the same way. And we survived. And animals mostly don't have structured language, and they survive.
So I was just thinking how like a seed is just like a reduction of a whole that precedes the animal, or the egg precedes the animal, but it is in a sense a reduction. And I think of language, which symbolically perhaps represents a reduction of a higher order idea. So symbolically, like what language is symbolically could be something that precedes something of greater mass, but it is inherently something that comes before, like a reduction or a compression of possibility.
Yes, you have to have the ability to abstract, and that's a characteristic of our mental space. We have abstraction capacities, and when we introduced language, those abstraction capacities who are limited with animals suddenly exploded. We can always abstract at a higher level, and abstraction is not a simple reduction. To abstract, you have to forget differences and regroup similarities. There's an analog component in abstraction. You have to spot out similarities and forget what is dissimilar. But you choose what you want to abstract. You choose the way you want to abstract. And abstraction has given us fantastic creative possibilities that animals cannot have. So the verbal distorts, creates another reality. It's not only a projection. It's not only a sort of bad picture. It's something else. It's completely something else. One of you was speaking before about Krishnamurti, and I was a very lucky guy in my life, I must say, because when I was young, Krishnamurti was coming to Stad and giving conferences every summer. And I was 20 or 25 years old, and I used to go every summer to meet him up there in Stad. It's half an hour from where I live, and I was able to assist to his conference and sometimes have dinner with him. And even one year, David Bohm was also there, and I must say that opened my mind, and that made me doubt very much about the reality that we were describing, about how real was the reality that we were describing. What finally convinced me, we are so used to live in ERP, to assume that what we see, what we touch, what is real is out there, that we completely neglect the fact that we have individuated, we have fragmented, we have abstracted, we have neglected things. What we describe is completely something else. What is out there has nothing to do with what we are describing. But the main thing is measurement. There's something from out there that we have collected really properly, and that has allowed us to survive, and that is measurement. So the nature of measurement is very important. But when we measure, we decide what we measure. We measure, we get a digital data, we get a number. We put to this number a unity. We say it's kilos, it's electron volt. And by putting this kilo, we project our mental space into the measurement. I don't know if I can express that properly, but we cannot avoid, even in measurement, to have our mental space interfere with what we are doing. But fortunately, it's good enough. It's good enough only for Darwinian reason. We would not have survived if it was not good enough. It was good enough up to now. Will it be good enough in the future also? I'm not so sure. Because we are not only adapting to things from who are outside, we are adapting to our own creations. We are starting to find beautiful things that human beings did and finding ugly things that nature did. So I'm very worried about that problem. I think it was David Dutch. He gives the following picture. He said, if you did a aerial photography 500 years ago of the Manhattan Island, and you have a photography now from the same point of view of the Manhattan Island, you see that something unnatural happened, something that should not have happened, something we have projected our mechanical way of doing things onto nature, and we are transforming the complexity of nature into the simplicity of mechanics. And we are doing that everywhere. Computer scientists define intelligence. Intelligence is this, okay? But this definition is so limited, but it's projecting on us also. So we are adapting to this definition of intelligence. I see how my daughter passes her exams. She has multiple choice questions. So obviously she's an intelligent person. So she learned how these multiple choice questions work a little bit. She doesn't care so much about the answer. She cares about how to answer. So we are adapting to our own creations in that sense. And we are mechanizing ourselves.
Just a quick point. You talk about the Manhattan Island, if you were to take a picture 500 years ago or now. But if you were to take a picture 500 years ago of Lucerne or the Dolomites, near there, or some of the communities in the Himalayas, they're not that different. So is it a New York State problem, or is it a human problem? I'm just kidding. I just wanted to...
Yes, let me tell you how I see things. I see that the verbal space, when it started developing, it has obviously brought us a lot of big advantage, and it was a survival advantage. We were capable of extending our time in the past, in the future, extending our space, knowing things through verbal explanation that we could have not learned otherwise. So it brought us a lot of advantage. But it was the beginning of the digital era. From that on, we went to more and more digitalization, less and less analogy, less and less intuition, creativity, etc., and more digitalization. And digitalization is machine, it's mechanic. As when I was a student, I had a professor named André de Lesser, and he said once, in logic, the best result you can get is 1 equals 1. Whatever you derive logically from that, you lose information. And that's true. The verbal world cannot create. It's only the natural world who can create. So we are going towards more and more mechanization, and this mechanization reflects on us. We think that robots should adapt to humans, but in fact humans are adapting to robots. We are adapting to our own creations, and I think that's really dangerous. We should preserve diversity. We should not only teach in university how to do things, not the how-to. There's the old proverb, you should not give a fish, you should learn to your children how to fish. But that's not even sufficient. There's another stage above. What we should allow is our mental space to discover fishing and other methods, and not how to fish, but discover fishing, because intelligence is above what the verbal world can do. It goes well beyond.
First of all, fantastic stuff you've been talking about and discussing. I bought 2 of your books tonight, and I'm going to check them out. And I haven't read them, so my apologies if, I'm asking kind of an obvious question based on your writing. But in a really refreshing viewpoint that you bring to this, I appreciated some of the comments you made about circular definitions in science. Feinstein pointed this kind of thing out as well. a lot of physics leans on the conservation of energy, and we haven't defined energy. But the first question I had is, I was curious whether you're familiar with Donald Hoffman's work or Roger Penrose.
Yes, I can't say I'm really familiar, but I read his books and I met him a few times. So
yeah, I mean, and he's kind of a controversial figure, which means he's probably for me it means he's interesting.
He's a genius.
But he agrees with you on the, and I agree with you on the uncomputability of consciousness. And he talks about the statement algorithms possess no understanding. He's put forth some mathematical proofs for that are pretty interesting. Yeah, so if you had any, big thoughts on that, I'd like to hear it. And then the other question I had was to kind of clarify, I think if I understand you right, you're not a dualist, but you've made some statements to the idea that, certain things are out of reach for science. But not being a dualist, at some point, there's some interaction at some level with, the physical world. And if that's the case, then my question is, does your theory make any specific testable predictions? If it does, then, what are those? And if we throw away experimental constraints for the sake of the discussion, what would you want to measure? And the last question I had was, I think if I understand correctly, you're working purely mathematically, but the question is, what if I don't have that correctly, what domain are you working in? And if it is math, I guess the question could be rephrased as, what, in your view, what is the relationship between mathematics and reality? And the reason I bring that up is my view. I see math as more as a language itself, and I'm kind of with Feynman when he said that math isn't a science, and he didn't mean that as a slam to mathematics. He just was pointing out that you can build up these internally consistent systems axiomatically that aren't formally or necessarily constrained by the physical world. And once you do that, you're kind of in this, you're starting to do physics, right? And this happens a lot. I mean, people will take a mathematical object and use it to analyze the world. And because that mathematical object is able to, produce these representations of the world, they start to attribute properties of that mathematical object to the external world. And people do this all the time with the Fourier transform, for example. So, and it definitely, if it sounded like pushback, it's not. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on these.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. I think that's a very, very interesting point. When I was younger, I suppose 99% of mathematicians, I was a Platonist. I believed that there was a Platonic world where mathematics were the king. But I changed my mind on that, and I must say very much because of neuroscience. I now believe that mathematics is, obviously it comes from out there. It started from out there. But from what we collected from out there, it then evolved completely in closed circuit. It's completely a brain creation, and that makes it incredibly powerful. There's one thing that differentiates mathematics from science, is in mathematics, you can define any object completely precisely. And that means that a circle, whatever feeling you attach to the word circle, and it can be very different. You can feel it's good, it's bad, it's repetitive, it's whatever feeling you attach to it, as long as it's defined mathematically, everybody will recognize it as a circle, even an extraterrestrial, if he is able to understand the language that you use to define it, everybody will have the same understanding. That means it's a brain, it's a verbal space creation, and it's not science. It doesn't need experiment to be proven or not proven. Mathematics has acquired such a power that because of its capacity of predicting, that it has really invaded physics. And I don't know if it has not invaded physics a little bit too much, because as existence in physics has become useful to explain something that we observe and not only what we observe, then physics relies completely on mathematics. So what we consider describing the reality is in fact also describing our own mental space. I don't know if this goes in the direction that you were saying, but now I forgot your first question.
Thank you for that. That was great. Maybe you did start in this direction, but the other question was about specific testable predictions, if there are any.
Oh, it's not a prediction. I'll go into a little bit more detail. But there's no general artificial intelligence. There will never be general artificial intelligence. But I'm putting a but to what I'm saying. But maybe will happen something that we say this is general artificial intelligence. So everybody will start believing that it's general artificial intelligence. It will only reduce our own intelligence. I don't know if I made myself clear enough. The mental space has this property, is that it can create things. By giving a name to something, we create something. If we create something and we call it by the name of some mental property, if we say this is intelligence, at that moment it exists, but it's not what we feel. So I'm saying there will never be general artificial intelligence, because by being artificial, it's already contradictory to the term intelligence. So that's one possible prediction, but there are many others. There are not only predictions, but there are also especially way of analyzing things, not only in science, but for instance also in economy. In economy, we create things and we adapt to our own creations, and then we use abstraction. For instance, money. Money is a purely mental concept. We created this concept, and then we abstract it. We have derivatives and derivatives and so on. So we create this reality who's purely based on mental creation, who have no physical existence. We give it physical existence, but that's a sort of inversion of the process. Instead of starting with the physical, we started with the mental. So we can imagine predictions, but we can also imagine very different ways of thinking about very usual entities or objects we are living with.
If I may ask really quick, I have a friend, she has a philosophy about the world, and I see it a little bit differently, but she always says that emotions are basically the true physics of the world. Since emotions are basically the least abstract thing that we maybe are experiencing, would you think that emotions are the closest to the reality as we can get?
Oh yeah, I really believe that emotions are the basis of, that's where we live. That's the world where we live. We live in an emotional world. We dress it up afterwards, but the basis is emotion, that's sure. Because of emotions, we have intelligence, we have intuition, we have understanding. All the basic structures of our reality derive from emotions, that's sure.
She says basically that we should start studying the emotions throughout the whole body and not just focus on the brain. What do you think about it?
I'm not sure I quite understood, but emotion are physical. The emotion come from the whole body, that's sure.
Professor, je m'excuse. Je m'appelle Imad Hamidullah from Toronto. Definitely, if you would like to continue, we're all here. But if you have to step away, we don't want to make you uncomfortable.
Well, thank you, Imad. Merci. I think I better go to have some sleep, because I will start to be boring. I noticed that when you're really tired, the first thing that disappears is the ability to speak a foreign language. So my English is getting worse and worse every second, so I better let you continue without me.
Dr. Ronald, thank you for joining us. I know that it's like maybe 4 a.m. there, or 5 a.m. you started
No,
to join us.
It's 6 a.m.
he started to join us at maybe 2:30 a.m. and we are very grateful for your generosity of your time for sharing this with us. And I hope you will give us more opportunity, invite you more in the club. And I hope you can join us again next week with Dr. Miguel Nicolelis because you have done several works with him. Yes. So thank you very much. And I hope you rest well. And I'm forever grateful to you because you never hesitated to accept our invitation, even if it's like at 2:30 a.m. at your time. So, yeah, my respect and my gratitude in behalf of all the group. And maybe Shara and other members, you want to say something to Dr. Ronald Cicurel?
Yeah, thanks Cecile and thanks Dr. Ronald. So I really appreciate your greatness and your generosity to share your knowledge with us. This is a fascinating night, Dr. Ronald. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure. I realized that my expression in English is not that good, and thank you for your patience in listening to my words and asking really good questions. And I hope I'll join you soon, perhaps with Miguel next week. Take good care, everybody, and thank you again for inviting me.
Merci beaucoup, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. Yeah, good night, Dr. Rina. Yeah, hope see you soon next week.